third-party content has been copied and communicated pursuant to Part 5A or 5B of the Copyright Act, unless indicated otherwise.
Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about project and contract evaluation. And so this is the last component of the jigsaw puzzle for you completing your project plan. So this class is directly relevant to that last section of your project plan. And we're also going to talk about the problems with contracts by looking at a case study, which is actually quite fun. And as you know, this week the seminars are devoted to finishing off your project plan, and there will be a bit of time in the seminar sessions to work through any last little difficult bits with Gantt charts and get them really nicely streamlined and working beautifully, I hope. But it also will mainly be about the structure and what to go into each component of your project plan. So one of the things that I was suggesting that people did last week for this week is, if you want to bring along written sections of your project plan to show Kate or me, then we can give you some feedback and let you know that you're on the right track. So it might be just one contingency plan, or it might be one activity that you describe in your methodology, just so that we can look at little snapshots of the way that you're putting it together and just check that you're on the right track. So if you'd like to bring along those little bits of written bit, that would be fantastic, and we'll have a look at those. But first of all, let's start off with project and contract evaluation. So I've put them together, project and contract, because really you will be evaluating the two things simultaneously. So really managing your project and managing your contract run simultaneously through your project. So you'll also be doing the evaluation simultaneously. So what the objective of evaluation is to appraise the progress and performance of your project against what you hoped for or what you planned. So see how you're going, whether you're achieving your goals, whether your outcome that you're reaching is actually what you were hoping for. Has everyone got these notes? Yeah? You've got access to them online? Good. Okay. Or you can also use it to compare progress and performance with other similar projects. And so this is getting to the point that I've been making all along the way, that what you learn and gain from one project, you need to make records of so that you can carry it forward into the next similar project that you're doing. And so evaluating your project as you go gives you that information that you can take forward into the next one. So it's very important, evaluation. And so evaluation sort of has 4 points that come together at the end, project and contract evaluation. But it actually goes on throughout your entire project. So you should be collecting information that you can use, that you're evaluating as you go, and you can also feed into that final evaluation at the end of the project. So the areas of input, well, you start off with the project brief, what your client wanted. And so a very important thing is to check that what you produced at the end is what your client actually wanted. Because you can undergo a great deal of activity and doing stuff and running the project and everything, but it is important that you end up with what your client actually wanted. So the project brief feeds into the final evaluation. So that's a pretty simple check. Did we get what the client wanted, or did the client get what they wanted? And then there's a whole lot of information to do with the actual specification of the contract, particularly if you're if you are a contractor contracting to the public sector, for example, or also the private sector. So what was outlined in the contract, is that what happened during the project? So contract specifications also feed into the final project evaluation. Also, all of that monitoring and record keeping and reporting that you're doing along the way is also summary information that can feed into the evaluation. So it is the evaluation and it feeds in finally to the evaluation. And the fourth pathway, of course, is actually doing the project. So creating the plan, implementation, looking at what you've got, and then that feeds into evaluation as well. So that's sort of just a nice box and arrow diagram that indicates how all of this information is collected from the different dimensions of your project and feeds into a final evaluation. Now, there's all sorts of benefits to be gained from evaluating as you go. So you identify problems earlier, you catch them, you can fix them. So that will help to keep your project on track. It improves project performance. So if you find that you're doing things a little bit inefficiently and maybe you're wasting a bit of time, wasting a bit of money and just slowly falling behind schedule with both your time and your money, also your quality, then it gives you the opportunity to think, right, we need to work more efficiently. And so to catch that sort of slow, subtle, backwards sliding creep before it becomes a significant problem. It also enables you to take stock all the way along at how every aspect of your performance along the way has been in terms of cost and time. It gives you the opportunity maybe to incorporate a technological advance that might have become available since when your project started. And remember, projects can very often run for years, and so you can expect some changes to come along that you might be able to embrace, and they will enhance your project. Also, evaluate the quality of the project management. All of that also links back with your performance in terms of cost and time, because if the project management isn't going well or the contract management isn't going well, that's likely to cause slippage in time and costs. So reducing costs leads on from those, speeding up the achievement of results leads on from the others as well. Identifying mistakes and fixing them is to do with your keeping track of your project performance. And of course, a really important one is actually giving information to your client. And I'm sure you're all incorporating in your reporting that giving information to your client. So that is a dimension of evaluation as well. It's also where you get together information, how are we going at this milestone, and so that's part of your data gathering also. This last one, the reconfirming the organisation's commitment to the project, by reporting and getting feedback, reporting to and getting feedback from your client at regular intervals, it does mean that you're constantly touching base and hopefully getting positive feedback and acknowledgement from your client. If your client suddenly starts to be ignoring you, then you might become a little bit concerned about their commitment to the project ongoing. And when we look at, in the next class, when we look at problems with contracts, we have a gigantic example of exactly that. So, yeah, just, keeping the conversation going and making sure that the client maintains their interest, really important. So why evaluate at the end? We've already said we evaluate all the way through, and you can see the reason for doing that: monitoring, reporting, keeping track of everything, time, costs and quality. But also at the end, it's really important to sit down and have a good think about how your project's gone and do whatever evaluation process you think is appropriate for your project. And so you can think about things about the time, cost and quality, obviously. And also, was it done in a proper and ethical manner? So were all of the people who had some connection with the project, so the client, the customers, the stakeholders, your team, were they all treated well in an ethical and proper manner? Very important sort of consideration, and we'll talk more about the ethics of projects or ethics of treating people in a moment. You also need to make sure that everybody, your client, stakeholders, customer, is happy with the final outcome. I mean, you may have achieved what the initial brief was, but is everybody happy with what you've come up as a solution or achieving that initial brief? And here's this point again. You do the appraisal, the evaluation, and that's information that you can then use as a springboard into your next project. So lessons for the future. And benchmarking is one of the ways that projects can be evaluated, and I suspect quite a few of you will decide to go down the benchmarking sort of route. And I'll talk about it in more detail in just a moment. Okay, so that's just a sort of a bit of a background and a reminder of why it's important to evaluate a project and contract and what you can do with it to help you develop your career in the future. But very broadly speaking, evaluation breaks down into two broad frameworks, the user framework and the process framework. And it depends on what sort of project you are doing as to which one would be the appropriate approach for you. So the user framework is looking at evaluating the project from the point of view of the client, the customer, the stakeholder. So it's a people-based evaluation. And it's essentially, were you happy with the way it was done, what was achieved, the outcome from the users and the stakeholders' point of view. The process framework is the sort of nuts and bolts framework. So it's more likely to be applicable to something like a construction project where you can evaluate from the point of view of the materials that were used, the resources, how efficiently the people were used or incorporated into the project. So the process framework is to do with effectiveness and efficiency, so time and money. Also how it was done. Was it done in accordance to standards, for example, or recognised guidelines, those sorts of things. And then the ethics and equity of how it was done as well. And ethics and equity are also to do with process largely, although they're people-oriented. So there's a little bit of crossover with these two, with the user framework, but there are processes in place around how people are managed and what we need to do with in terms of equity and ethics. So just at a very rough cut at this point in time, what do you think, which of these two broad categories do you think your project might fall into? So who thinks it's going to be a user framework? Okay, and who thinks it's going to be a process framework? Great, and is anybody unsure? Okay, we can work with yours to identify which one. So we'll work on that during the seminar session. Of course, it is possible to have a bit of both, so you can be in between as well. But if you can just think of it as, am I in the user framework or am I in the process framework? That's a really helpful starting point. Okay, so the user framework. It can be from the point of view of the client who commissions the project and of course provides the funding. They're the ones who want it done. And the services or your project has to be delivered according to what their specification was and so to their satisfaction. So if the government or the public sector is your client, then the actual the user framework components are likely to be written into the contract right up front, because government contracts are pretty rigorous and hot on that sort of thing. But another constraint is that when you're dealing with the government is that you're tied into an annual reporting process cycle. So the project might go on for 3 or 4 years, but you have to evaluate and report to your client formally every year around the end of the financial year. So, hands up for whose project is in the private sector. Okay, just one. Everybody else is in the public sector. So, local government, state government, federal government. Yep, okay, good. It's important to know where you are with respect to, it's another part of important thing to have in mind with respect to evaluation. Okay, so remember, the customer is the beneficiary of the service. Often it's the public in general, but it might be a specific group of people. And so one of the approaches to evaluating customer happiness is to do a customer satisfaction survey. And so this is an evaluation tool that you might want to use. It has to be professionally designed and not biased, and it has to be run in an ethical manner. So here's that crossover between doing the user framework and the process framework, or one of many possible crossovers. So doing a satisfaction survey, but for anybody who's ever been failed up for a survey, what are some of the things that you are guaranteed when you do a well-designed survey? Yes, they only ever take between 10 and 20 minutes. Yep, that's one thing, but that's not really an ethical consideration. Or they should be honest with you, you know, because if you start on I've started on many surveys and it says 10 to 20 minutes, and sort of an hour later and I'm still ploughing through it. So that's a little bit dishonest there. Yeah, there should be a letter outlining who it's for, how you were selected, why you're selected, what it's going to be used for, and that would be in the plain language statement. So that would be part of it. Confidentiality is a big one. Yep. So to be a truly unbiased and ethical sort of survey, you have to be guaranteed confidentiality. But on top of that, what else do they usually assure you of down the track? Yeah, that's right, that you won't go on a list. Yep, but what else? There's usually an assurance that at any time in the future you can withdraw your data. Survey. Yep, yep. Yeah, so when it's used, it's coded so that you can't be identified. But at any stage, you should be able to pull your data out.
They normally say that when you sign the agreement, once you finish the study, it's complete.
Yeah, especially in scientific ones, once it's published, you can't go and pull one of your sample out of that data. But anyway, you do have the opportunity to withdraw. So if you do it one day and then you do the survey one day and then the next day you think, oh, I'm not really comfortable with that, you should be able to withdraw your input. Okay, so if you're going to do a survey, this means it's a whole nother big activity to go into your Gantt chart, because you can see you've got to write the survey, you've got to distribute it, you've got to collect it, you've got to analyse the data, all of those sorts of things that I've just outlined in what happens with a really well-run, ethically run survey. So it's a whole nother activity that's going to take time and effort. So, professionally designed and not biased. And the questions will relate to some indicator of quality or satisfactory service. For example, if you were surveying people who were going into a kiosk in a reserve area, one of the indicators of performance of your project might be that 90% of customers are served within 3 minutes of entering the kiosk. So you'd be asking the people, how long did it take before you were approached and served when you entered? So that would be part of your survey. So when you're designing the survey, it's important to have the information that you would like to get out of it clearly identified. So how quickly people are being served is one of the objectives of doing this survey. Or if you're doing a weed control sort of project, it might be that something that your goal is that weeds will be reduced to, say, 2% of cover. So there's another guideline or measure of quality that you can use. Yep. Okay, so the stakeholder doesn't pay for the service, but they're going to be influenced in some way by the project. So they may or may not be a customer or have the option to be a customer, but in some way they are being influenced by the project. Now, as you know from our discussions along the way, keeping your stakeholders on side is really important. And if they are not happy, they can do a lot of damage to how quickly your project runs. For example, delaying the planning permit application process. So really important to keep your stakeholders on site. But you can't ever guarantee that every one of your stakeholders is going to be happy. Some of them may find that they perceive they're being adversely influenced by your project. And so in those cases, it's really very important that the process that you've carried out in actually undertaking the project, so that's engaging in stakeholder conversations, consultation, getting all the permits, following whatever the standard procedure is, so process, has all been done according to the book. And then stakeholders can still be a bit unhappy, but they can't fault the way the project has actually been done. So you can minimise, in that case, the resistance or negative feedback from your stakeholders. So once again, although maybe you're surveying your stakeholders, there's a little bit of overlap with the process. Your stakeholders are going to be less likely to be against your project if the process has been carried out faultlessly. So once again, if stakeholder consultation is important to your project, then it's another activity in your project plan. So that would need to be incorporated. Okay, so moving on now to the process framework. So this is to do with effectiveness, efficiency, process, equity and ethics, if appropriate. So the efficiency is really about the time and the cost. How efficiently were resources managed? Did you keep the budget under control? Did you keep it within the time frame that you'd planned? So efficiency. So the time and cost efficiency can be negatively influenced by things like poor project or contract planning or management. So you may go wrong, you may have gone wrong right back in the planning stage. And in the example that we're going to talk about, problems with contracts next, the feasibility planning stage was at fault in that project. So that can have major impacts on the efficiency with which a project runs. Another thing that can influence the efficiency is the variations that we've talked about along the way. So you've got your project plan outlined, you've got your time and your costing, and then something happens to incorporate a variation. Any variation, anything you have to add to your project is going to cost time and money. So being very wary of variations is really important. In managing efficiency, but also if you do find that you're a little bit over time or over cost at the end in your evaluation, you can look back and say, well, actually that's because we had to do that extra little bit of work, and so the overrun is not too bad because we did the extra work. So you did get something for your extra time and money. It's not that you just got behind. All right, effectiveness has a lot to do with quality specifications. Now, effectiveness is also to do with what the original specification was and what you got at the end. So it's a mix of those two, the quality and actually meeting the specified requirements of the project. Now, this often relies a little bit on judgment, the effectiveness, because it might be that it's the client's perception of whether or not the project is effective, or the customer's perception of whether or not the project is efficient. So, you know, the project could have been to create a pair of pants like this, but if they're way too big or way too small, you've got the pair of pants, but it's not effective. They're the wrong size. The project outcome is of the wrong scale for what it was designed to achieve. And then you can just have the project's just gone astray along the way in terms of quality. So a big difference between what was proposed, what was eventually achieved, and what was actually in the brief to begin with. So effectiveness is a little bit more of a qualitative thing. Okay, so now the process in terms of validity and reliability. So the question is, was the process that was carried out, did it follow things like using the appropriate building materials, following a standard like an international standard or an Australian standard or a New Zealand standard? If you were doing a survey of people, was it done in an ethical manner? So these can all be dimensions of, was the process done correctly? So you remember our boardwalk example where we identified all sorts of ways that our boardwalk project was going wrong. And yet there is a standard that clearly outlines how and what dimensions and what guidelines should be used in doing boardwalks and paths and lookouts and small bridges and all of those sorts of infrastructure. So in terms of validity, you might have something like in a research project, was it done rigorously? So in a research project, you have a hypothesis that you want to test, but it could be that when you test it, you get your hypothesis confirmed or not. Now, it doesn't really matter which way it goes, so long as the research was done absolutely rigorously and supports the conclusion you came to at the end. And that sort of leads on to the next one. If it was done again, would you get the same result? So the validity and the reliability. If you don't do it rigorously, then chances are you won't get the same result next time you try it. Ethics and equity, another dimension of the process. Was the project contract conducted in a fair and ethical manner? So the classic example, of course, is our survey. Confidentiality, security of data, ownership of the data. That was another point that we didn't cover earlier. Often, well, the ownership is to do with you who've contributed the data, but also where it's kept. It should be under lock and key in a very safe place, either electronically or physically, and the ability to withdraw. So that's sort of the ethics of doing a survey. And also other things to be aware of is cultural sensitivities as well. So it may also include things like, in the Koori case, interviewing Indigenous people. It may be okay to make notes about what you're being told in an interview, but it's not okay to record the interview and transcribe it later. So cultural sensitivity comes into the ethics of it as well. And then equity applies especially to human-related public sector projects and contracts. So things like, I mean, a very common example is that pay equity needs to be there for men and women, Aboriginal groups, people from other countries, disabled workers, or aged people. And so equity needs to be applied across the board. And that's a big issue at the moment for all universities, for example, and science faculties within universities. There's big inequity between the amount of money that men and women are paid and also levels of seniority in science faculties. In fact, we're the faculty that drags down the statistics for the whole university. It's not unique to Deakin, it's all universities that have science faculties. Okay, so that's just sort of giving you a quick overview of the people-oriented approach or the process-oriented approach. So what sort of tools can you use? Well, in the process side, process approach, you can use performance indicators and standards. They're easy ones. So if you have a standard for building, for example, use that, because that's a very good guide to measure your project against. Was it done according to the standard? It should have been. But there may be other processes or guidelines that the rest of your industry uses that you can compare your processes to. Now remember, right back when we were talking about project monitoring in the first half of the trimester, we said don't monitor everything because somebody will spend all of their time monitoring. Similar, that sort of leads on to evaluation as well. You need to pinpoint the things in your project that are absolutely critical to the success of your project, and that's where your evaluation focuses. That's also where your monitoring should be focusing, so it's easy to link the two. You monitor the critical things and you use that data, those data, as the basis for your evaluation. So do not evaluate against non-critical factors. And because every project is unique, so in this room we've got 20 or so different projects, you have to identify in your project what's critical for the success of your project. So it won't be the same for any two people or any two projects. So the sort of tools. Effectiveness, use quality standards, compliance. Efficiency, you can base your evaluation on things like the time and output targets. time and cost. Process, standards, codes of practice, compliance. Ethics, you can rely on HR and occupational health and safety sorts of guidelines, compliance and guidelines. Equity, make sure that there's no discrimination happening in your workforce or in your project. So there's a sort of suite of basic tools that you can use depending on which ones you think are appropriate. So a lot of it's to do with you actually thinking about, well, identifying first of all what those critical things to monitor and evaluate are, and then think about, well, how am I going to monitor and evaluate and collect the data? So it could be done through compliance checks, so checking that you are meeting or complying with standards, reports, keeping track of your reports, surveys, not just of people, but you might also do surveys of things that are being used. So resources being consumed, services being utilised, all of those sorts of things. And you can also, and you should be, keeping a close eye through inspections on what's happening on the ground in your project. So this next point about collection of information shouldn't hinder your project. So that goes back once again to make sure that you just evaluate the things that are critical. And as much as possible, if you can automate your data collecting process, then that will be a very efficient way to do it and save you a lot of time. Remember our cost chart of accounts that we talked about for keeping track of finances in the first half of the unit. This is really where it comes into its own. So you've not only used it to keep track of your expenditure, you can now use it to evaluate. So you've got a data set that's full of what did I buy, how much did it cost, how many did I use, all those sorts of things. So now you can use this for evaluating certainly the cost component of your project. So a chart of accounts is a very handy tool, handy tool along the way, handy tool in evaluation. Okay, outcomes and outputs. Let's start with outcomes. If you are working for the public sector, as I said earlier, you will need to be reporting based on the end of financial years. But it also means that the funding that will come to you will be reapproved at the end of every financial year based on how your project is progressing. So if it's on time and on budget, hopefully it will simply be a rollover of funding. If it's behind or over cost, then it may be reassessed, which you don't really want to happen. Now, your project running over 3 or 4 years, there may be an outcome at the end of that 3 or 4 years, or even 10 years down the track. That is what your project is trying to achieve. So it might be a weed eradication project where you throw in lots of herbicide, remove the weeds, apparently, but you still need to check years down the track whether or not that has been an ongoing reduction in the weeds. Or it may be enhancement of biodiversity that you're trying to achieve. So after a couple of years, you may not see anything much, but 10 years down the track, you can really see whether or not species have come back, whether they're breeding successfully, all of those sorts of things. So the outcome can be beyond that annual reporting. And so government needs to have some way, when you're reporting to your funding body, your government, of deciding or being able to see that things are on track. So if we just stick with our weeds example, what you report at the end of each financial year is called the outputs. And so for our weeding project, the output can be the quantity of herbicide used. I used 25 litres of herbicide. I used it on time, but I don't know yet what the outcome of that's going to be. However, that's an output. I sprayed 15 hectares on time using my herbicide, but I still don't know what the outcome of that spraying of that area is going to be. So, but you can say, I used the herbicide, I sprayed this area. So those are outputs. And you can report that at the end of the financial year. See the difference? See the relationship? Good. Very important one. Okay, now benchmarking is comparing your project with another similar project. But that similar project has to be pretty much the same scale and scope and objective as yours. It's no good trying to compare your project with one that's 10 times bigger, because there'll be all sorts of difficulties associated with scaling up that aren't in your project. So you've got to find one that is similar to yours and same size and scope. Best practice is when you look around the country or the world and you find that project, it's the one that's done the job best. So that could be the most efficiently, usually the most efficiently, or it could have had the best outcome in terms of what its eventual outcome is. So it could be efficiency that's done best, can be outcomes, usually a combination of the two. So the best performing similar project to yours is the one that you compare your project to in terms of evaluating it and its eventual outcomes. So yeah, effectiveness and efficiency, but also process, equity and ethics as well. Now you can also do audits along the way. And that's where you, in order for it to be a valid evaluation, generally speaking, you would get in an external auditor who's impartial and independent from your project to come in and look at particularly the finances, how they were managed, how well you complied to quality standards, those sorts of things. And so these will be auditors that are specialists in their field who you can employ, come in, do an audit. So they could do audits along the way, and or they can do an audit at the end. So that's an approach for evaluating your project. So it tends to be for larger projects that you would get in external auditors. There are environmental auditors, and for example, a few years ago, Deakin brought in environmental auditors to audit our power usage and our water usage, and found all sorts of interesting things in terms of leakages and misuse of power. So, well, leakages of water and misuse of power. So doing that in conjunction with EPA was a really powerful tool for working out where our leakages were, for one thing, and also where power wastages were happening. So things like equipment being left on permanently and soaking up power all of the time. And there was actually a water leak found between the library and Building T. So you could monitor the water going sort of as far as the library, and you could monitor the water being used at Building T, and there was a mismatch which indicated that there was a leak happening. So it then gave you the opportunity to go and look for that leak and fix it. Yeah, so this last point at the bottom, Certainly government projects that are really big and expensive, you're likely to use external environmental or other auditors, financial auditors, but also projects that are in some way unique or new will tend to be audited as well. Okay, and one of the things that it asks you in your putting together your project plan about evaluation is, why am I doing this evaluation? What's the value of it? And something that will be relevant to everybody is this idea of carrying forward the lessons learned in this project to the next one. So those lessons learned are things like costing, and we talked about how you can base your initial costing for this project on a rough guideline you can use is what it costs to do the previous similar project. So in terms of funding future projects, but also, of course, in how it was carried out and how successful it was and what did and didn't work is also important information to carry forward as well. Okay, anyone want to suggest what approach? You've already thought about whether you're going to use the user approach or the process approach. Anyone got an evaluation tool in mind? Who wants to do a survey? Nobody? Oh, okay, one person. So surveys are usually pretty popular. Benchmarking? Yeah, got a few benchmarkers. Good. Okay. Okay, so that's just a sort of quick overview of the sort of tools that people commonly use. Okay, so this is just an overview of the territory we've covered today in thinking about what is evaluation, why do we use it, and what sort of tools can we use. So we'll just finish with that one. Now, would you like to take a 10-minute break or a 5-minute break? If you take a short break, we'll probably finish early. Any votes? Hands up for a short break? Hands up for a long break? No? Okay, just have a chat whilst I move on to the next class. Stand up, stretch, talk to people. So during the seminars today, this week, we'll be able to have a look at your project and talk about what sort of evaluation processes might be appropriate. No, you've got time, be quick. Hi. And it's online. Okay, everyone, let's talk about the problems with contracts. Now, along the way, we've talked about the importance of contracts and sort of also sort of thought a little bit about what can go wrong with them. But I wanted to give you an overview of how seriously big contracts can go wrong, and when they do, how really expensive it can be. And so I'm using this case study to illustrate the points. This is the Seal Rocks case study. Now, how many people have been to the Nobbies? Yep. Was it a long time ago or fairly recently? A couple of months. So what was there? Yep. And can you see the seals? Yeah. But did you go into the information centre?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not from there, no.
No. Okay. Right. Did you see anything different? No, about that? Boardwalk? Couldn't see a single seal. Okay. Hmm? Oh, you could see the penguins. That's good. All right. This is a project that went horribly wrong. The concept, or the vision, was to, there's the Seal Rock Centre there, was to put in a lift that would take you down underground, where you would jump onto a underground train, and that would take you 2 kilometres out to somewhere around where the seals are, and then you'd step into a lift and you'd come up part way to where the seals were swimming around underwater, so you'd be able to watch them swimming around, and then you'd get back in the lift and it would take you to 9 metres above the seals so that you could look down and watch them cavorting and basking in the sun and doing all the things that seals do. You didn't see that when you went there?
No, it didn't happen.
You're right, it didn't happen. It tried. But it didn't happen. This was going to be such a tourist attraction that you would have to make a booking 3 years in advance to go there. They were expecting 5,000 visitors a day is what was going to be the experience. And they were going to be bringing in $720,000 a month, so huge money spinner. The experience would be linked with the penguin parade, so you can imagine you would go down to Phillip Island, you'd go out to the Nobbies and watch the seals, and then you'd transfer across to the penguin parade to see the penguins come in at dusk. Fantastic. And there would shuttle buses, to be shuttle buses between the two, and later there'd be a monorail that would just shuttle people between the two. And there'd also be a fine dining restaurant at the Nobby Centre. So what did you get to eat at the Nobby Centre, if anything?
No, there's a cafe there.
Yeah, and selling
Coffee, snacks.
donuts, dim sims, yeah, right. Not 5-star fine dining. Yeah, okay. So the vision started off back in 1993, where the managing director of Seal Rocks Victoria had the vision, and he sold it to the Premier at the time, Jeff Kennett. And Jeff Kennett signed a 25-year contract to develop the Seal Rocks Centre into Ken Armstrong's vision. Now, in 1998, the first $17 million Stage 1 Sea Life Centre was complete, and that replaced the kiosk. Okay, so it got off to a good start. Within a year, $17 million had been spent, and the new high-quality Sea Life Centre was in place. Okay, but at the completion of Stage 1, it stalled. And so it was held up, Stage 2 was held up, because that was going to be the lift down, the train across, and the lift up to the 2 viewing platforms underwater and above the seals. That was Stage 2. That was really the expensive one, but Stage 1 happened and then everything stopped for a while. And so in the interim, people were watching live TV. So they had some cameras out there that were actually filming what the seals were doing, and that was being beamed back to the visitor centre. And so this was sort of a bit of a taster for things to come. But the laser beam on the camera went on the blink not too far down the track. So they replaced that with a video loop of what had been filmed in the past. So you got the same loop of the seals doing the same thing over and over again. I'm not sure how long the loop was, hopefully more than a minute or two, but it was a poor replacement for actually live viewing, and certainly it wasn't approaching the expectation. So what do you think's happening here? Why do you think the real-time viewing was replaced? What's it indicative of if the real-time viewing is replaced by a loop? No seals. No, the seals were still there, fine. What does it suggest about the management of the centre? I've got a U-Butte camera system out there beaming the video back, breaks down, and they replace it with a loop.
They couldn't fix it?
Couldn't fix it, or couldn't, didn't want to fix it, couldn't fix it, didn't want to fix it, not worth it, or didn't have enough money. Yeah. So there's financial problems because Stage 2 is not happening, and Stage 1 is struggling. So, you know, this wasn't really a incentive for people to come in really big numbers. And so international visitors weren't coming, and the fine dining restaurant wasn't being visited. So if people aren't coming, then they're not going to stay for fine dining. When we're talking fine dining, we're talking about, you know, $100 per couple meals sort of thing. So people who are just rocking up to have a look at the visitor centre are really more interested in a cup of coffee and a snack rather than fine dining. So cash flow and maintenance problems were the thing that was happening there. So in the first year, they lost $3.7 million. So that's a very significant loss because they just couldn't provide access to the seals in any meaningful way, not even being able to watch them in real time. So the venture was in trouble. So it was really always going to be a problem until the second stage was in place. So what do you think was possibly going wrong here as well? About the whole concept, what was going wrong? What had gone wrong? The other thing that was happening at the same time is that the managers of the Penguin Parade really didn't want anything to do with Seal Rocks. They were focused on their very successful tourist experience, people going to watch the Penguin Parade. So they really didn't want anything to do with this, what was looking like a bit of a shonky operation now happening. And also residents were concerned, the local residents, because there are people obviously who live on Phillip Island, they perceived, and probably rightly so too, that there was a threat to the fairy penguins. So if you've got fine dining happening in the evenings, then that means people are going to be coming and going from the restaurant at night. And at dusk is when the penguins come up to their burrows. And so if you've got traffic happening in the evening, then the penguins are a lot more vulnerable to being run over. Before they cleared the houses away from that area, I went down to stay at a friend's house, and we were leaving at duskish, and there were so many penguins on the road that I had to walk in front of the car and shoo them off. So we're dead slow, and I was chasing penguins out of the way. There are that many penguins. So having traffic coming and going on the road is a real threat to the penguins. And also, there was discussion, so apart from the threat to the road, there was discussion about closing the road as well to address this problem. So two sides to it. One was it is a problem and a threat to the penguins. The other flip side of the problem for the residents is the threat that the road would be closed. Okay, so this one here, if you think about it, really the whole feasibility of the project was flawed, the thinking about it, because really it was never going to work until that stage 2 was in place. Certainly the fine dining restaurant. The Penguin Parade hadn't actually been entered into a contract with Ken Armstrong. So he'd developed the concept, linking the Nobbies with Penguin Parade, but the Penguin Parade weren't part of the negotiation or the contract. So they're just saying, well, we don't care. We've got no responsibility to help. In fact, we'd rather it did fail, because once again, it focuses everybody on coming to the Penguin Parade. And of course, you've got the problem down here of now the stakeholders are offside. So the stakeholders in this case are the local residents. So they began to think about this and recognise there were problems, and so they brought in an independent arbiter, Roger Gillard. Anyone remember where in the problem-solving string arbitration occurs? Almost at the very end. So we start off with problem-solving, and then negotiation, mediation, arbitration, litigation. So we're already way down the track. So all of those earlier interventions have failed. So no problem solving, no negotiation, we're at arbitration, where somebody else looks at the evidence and makes decisions, because mediation hasn't worked. So Roger Gillard QC was brought in to look at the contracts. And the sorts of things he found written in there were that the government pledged to use best endeavours to ensure that the venture succeeded. What's wrong with best endeavours? Yeah, so it's it's open to every individual's interpretation. So my understanding of best endeavours might be quite different to your understanding of best endeavours. So it doesn't really lock anybody in, as a contract should, to doing something specific, just their best endeavours. And so Gillard found that the state government had failed to do their best endeavour to ensure that the project succeeded. So senior public services, he actually decided that senior public servants had caused difficulties, failed by Seal Rocks. So there was a big problem in actually writing the contract. You would never write best endeavours into your contracts, would you? Does it even seem silly to you? Yeah, a few people nodding, a few people sleeping. So never write anything like loose terms like best endeavours into your contracts. Okay. Now, this is an ongoing long-term project, and governments run in cycles. The best they might be is in power for 4 years, but things happen along the way, like by-elections, where a seat becomes vacant for some reason and somebody has to be elected to fill that seat. So the Kennett government, which was a Liberal government, was caught in a by-election campaign against an independent candidate, Susan Davies. And Susan Davies was very much against the development. She didn't want another major tourist attraction so close to the existing Penguin Parade. At the same time, the Ken Armstrong's organisation was forced to build their own car park, which they hadn't intended building. It wasn't part of the budget. Remember, there were going to be shuttle buses and then there was going to be the monorail. So they hadn't factored in a big car park. Okay, so this is your classic unfunded contract variation. So all of a sudden, Ken Armstrong had to build a car park, and not a cheap one either, $11 million. So quite a substantial thing. The Labor government or the Labor Party who were in opposition had always opposed the development. It was a Liberal Party idea. And now there's a state election coming up, and the Labor government, the Cumming-Brax government, was actually campaigning, elect us and we will ensure that the Nobby's development doesn't go ahead. So they were campaigning on the basis of it not going ahead, and they won. So once the Brax government won in 1999, the project was doomed. They were not going to honour the contract to go ahead with stage 2. So that means that the project is now no longer viable. So remember, this was one of the reasons that a contract might be terminated, is if it's no longer possible to complete, then both parties might decide that they'll walk away. And that's what Ken Armstrong said they would do. They'll walk away from the facility. They're losing money. Stage 2 is not going to happen. We're just going to walk away. At the same time, there were problems happening within the system. There were 6 unfair dismissal cases, and there were sexual harassment. There was a sexual harassment case as well. So that was from the staffing point of view, but they also had more problems with the facility. The indoor boat ride was no longer working, so the boats weren't going around. The EPA found that there was toxic effluent being released into the waters of the Penguin Parade, penguin habitat, and of course there were financial shortfalls because visitors just weren't coming to what is now recognised as very much a second-class tourist attraction. So there were internal conflicts over personal and personnel issues, and obviously ongoing cash flow problems. Because all of these things like, breakdowns is obviously indicative of a cash flow problem. The fact that contaminated water is being pumped into the penguin habitat is also indicative of cash flow. These things are not being fixed because there's no money. More problems. The access road is now closed at dusk due to concern for the penguins. Now that means that any evening dining is not going to happen. So that part of the business completely fails. So no evening trade for the restaurant. And the operators are still constantly in dispute with the Penguin Parade about closing times. So what time is the Nobbies going to close and close their access gate? Why is it important to the Penguin Parade to have the nobbies closed at a particular time every day. Sorry? Yeah, that's part of it.
Couldn't they
Who move? No, they walk around all over the place, everywhere in fact. The Penguin Parade wants the nobbies closed at dusk so that everybody comes over to the Penguin Parade because that's when the penguins come in. So once again, in the planning of the project, the initial looking at the feasibility, it was fundamentally flawed. There was always going to be conflict between viewing the penguins and viewing the seals, particularly that overlap between at dusk or in the evening. So real lack of predicting problems and of course no contingency plans in place. So there was no, well, what if things break down? What if we don't get that stage 2 funding? That's the big what if that should have been in there. What are we going to do? What service are we going to operate based on stage 1? So Ken Armstrong made endless contacts with government, 69 in fact, in the month of the election, months after the election. So we've now had transition from Kennett government to Bracks government. Cheryl Garbutt was the new Environment Minister for the Labor Party government, and she told, and he was telling Cheryl Garbutt, the Environment Minister, who should be responsible for this project, or partly responsible, that the government was in breach of contract. So got the new government coming in, and now they've suddenly realised they've got a problem on their hands with this project. And of course, Cheryl Garbutt, who's Labor, now of course blamed the previous Liberal government for the contractual problems. And she was probably right as well, but it's a classic example of political buck passing. So the new government said, well, it was signed and set up by the previous government, so it's their fault. We shouldn't really have to worry too much about it. So they appointed Andrew Rogers as the project monitor, and his job was to carefully track what was going on with the development and the contract and report monthly. So that's keeping a very close eye on what's happening. So 3 months down the track, which is not very long for a government coming in and a new appointee, he's looking at what's happening, he's looking at the contracts and how things are running. Very quickly he comes to the conclusion that it's a complete mess and warns the government that the project's in trouble. So although the contract had been set up and signed by the Kennett government, it still does pass to the next government, which is a Labor government, to take on the responsibility for continuing the project. So there'd been a real failure of communication between the client and the project monitor because he just really wasn't listened to. So very quickly he was saying, this is a mess, major problem, but the government still did nothing for some time. So in 2000, the Seal Rocks enterprise asked for a rental reduction or waived because they were paying the government, with the idea being that they're making this huge $720,000 a month profit, they should be paying something back to the government. In exchange for reducing or doing away with the rental, they were happy to, or they were in agreement to have their opening time reduced, so that gets more people going over to the Penguin Parade, and have the access road actually closed at dusk. They no longer required using they no longer had to use the Penguin Parade car park because they had their own, which they paid $11.5 million to develop. And if the rental had been waived, they would have saved about $3.6 million over 10 years. So very substantial saving, and they're also offering to do all of those things. The Bracks government said, you are a commercial operation, you should be paying your rent. So suck it up, in effect. Armstrong said that the Kennett government, in their death throes, just as they were losing the election, had agreed to these variations, and that the agreement had been sent off to the lawyers for signing off. But they forgot to do it, or they didn't get to it. And the Kennett government lost the election. The Bracks government came in, so that was no longer relevant. That was all stuff that happened during the Kennett government era. So once again, we've got another contract variation happening here, all of these changes. There was no cooperation between the government and Ken Armstrong. The Bracks government wasn't going to do anything that they absolutely didn't have to do to help. And this is classic bad contract monitoring and management. Ken Armstrong's organisation should have been saying, we can see that the government's probably going to lose and change. He should have been on the doorstep of the solicitors saying, sign here, let's get this done before the end of the election process. Anyway, Garbutt actually recommended the renegotiation of the contract, but the Bracks government didn't do it. So in return, they had offered to close earlier each day, and also another part of it was completely abandon the second stage. Remember, the contract still existed to do the second stage. It just hadn't got around to be funded by the Kennett government, and it was never going to be funded by the Bracks government. So best to just agree that that second stage of the contract was going to be abandoned. Bracks government rejected the offer. So you can begin to think that maybe there's something going on behind the scenes here, because a lot of these negotiations would seem obvious to help. It almost seems that the actions were directed at completely sabotaging the operation. Once again, the operators offered another $11.5 million to enhance the centre. So this is bringing things back up to standard, getting things operating again. But the government refuses, preferring to go to arbitration. So once again, we're right on the edge of legal action, getting somebody else to come in and have a look and make a decision. The arbiter came in and the government lost the case. And they were directed to pay compensation to the operators of around $60 million by this stage, was the compensation that they were directed to pay. So this is taxpayers' money. So we had goodwill by the operators to renegotiate, rejected. The government went to arbitration, they lost, they should have known they would lose. So very bad contract management by the government in this case. So Gillard found that the public servants had ignored all the warnings that the project was going badly. During the whole arbitration process, they gave no indication that they understood what was going on or what the implications were. Total disinterested. And as I said, it wouldn't have taken a lot of effort for a positive response, which would have saved certainly that 60 million and probably a lot more as well. So the Garbutt, the Environment Minister, blames sloppy contract management by the Kennett government. Fair enough, it's looking pretty bad. Louise Asher Deputy Opposition Leader says Labor was opposed from the start because they just wanted to support that independent Susan Davis. That was the reason. And it was actually the Bracks government got into power because of the support of just 3 independents, one of whom was Louise Asher. So they were bending over backwards to give the independents what they wanted to get them to join the Bracks government or support the Bracks government. In response, Davis pointed out that Asher was actually the tourism minister when the project started, and so had actually had a significant hand in the whole failure of the thing. Okay, so typically, once again, political buck passing, point scoring was going on at the expense of the project. Okay, Gillard gave the Armstrong 2 choices. Continue to run the facility and accept a sum of money to compensate them for their past losses, of which was a lot, and also to compensate them for their future losses, 6.8 million. We know this is going badly for you, you're going to continue to lose money, we'll give you $6.8 million. And finally, reduce those rental fees. So that would have been another 3.6 million over 10 years. That was option 1. Option 2, withdraw from the attraction altogether. Walk away, withdraw. Accept payment representing all of the money that had been outlaid by Ken Armstrong's organisation since 1996. So all the money that had been put in by Armstrong, including the interest on money that had been borrowed over that time. And the decision was, the operators just said, no, we're out. This is such a mess. Contract has been so badly managed, we're just going to leave. So option number 2. So the contracts were all terminated, and the Nobby's Centre moved from being a sort of privately run organisation to being state government responsibility. Okay, all right, so that's a real milestone in the history. There was a judicial inquiry, so finally we've gone to legislation. And the accusations were actually political interference in the running of the centre, which, you know, that suspects that there's something going on behind the scenes. And evidence was actually produced to suggest that there'd been an arrangement between Davies, the independent, and Bracks to deprivatise the centre. And this is what had been essentially achieved. It was no longer being run by a private organisation, it was transferring to government, being government run. And so part of this legislation was to investigate the conduct of the ministers involved. So it's become a legal battle now. So as far as it goes, as far as conflict resolution goes, it's the worst possible outcome, actually going to court. You wouldn't believe it, but in the week before the transition from private to public ownership was going to happen, there was a huge storm and the wind ripped the roof off the centre, causing $200,000 worth of damage. Fortunately, no injuries. But it's sort of in that no man's land where it was transitioning from private to public ownership. And so when they talked to the insurance companies, the insurance company that was engaged by Ken Armstrong said, not our responsibility, it's now a public feature. And of course the government insurers were going, no it's not, we haven't completely taken over yet. So it's in limbo because they can't get anyone to pay at this stage for the repairs. Another thing that was not handled ethically was the staff were paid out. So all of their long service leave, any salary that was owed to them was paid out rather than simply moving from the private sector to the public sector, as was the arrangement, was that the staff wouldn't lose their jobs, they just moved from one to the other. But somebody in managing this transition had decided, well, we'll pay out the staff, not realising that there was now going to be a gap until the centre was repaired. So everybody had been virtually sacked. If they hadn't been paid out, in the transition and the repair period, they would have continued to have their jobs and been paid, even though they couldn't go to work. Anyway, that was a very bad outcome for the employees. The management of the Nobbies was now going to be integrated into the Penguin Parade and the Phillip Island Nature Park, so into that suite of attractions. A guy called Frank King was appointed as the interim executive officer of Seal Rock, so essentially the manager. And he said to the staff, your jobs are guaranteed. As soon as we do the repairs, you will be back on the job. You will be given first right of refusal. You'll be offered your job back and you have the option to accept it or refuse it. And it was estimated that that would just be 2 months and everybody would be back at work and the centre would be operating again. There was a Supreme Court challenge at this stage to try and avoid paying the $60 million compensation to Ken Armstrong. And part of the deal centred around closing the gate at dusk. Now, why do you think there might be any problem with closing the gates at dusk? With the timing. Yeah. So dusk is different in summer as to winter, and even during summer, if it's a cloudy, overcast day, dusk will be earlier than on a nice sunny day. So it's as bad as best endeavours. Yeah, true. I imagine you'd chase them out though. It's like the Penguin Parade when the rangers go down the beach and say, all right, you get off the beach because the Penguin Parade's about to happen. But yeah, good point. So we've got another terrible term, loose wording of the contract, closing the gates at dusk and getting everybody out. So more delays as the storm damage was being assessed and the insurance companies were arguing over who was responsible. And also the appeal was in the court system not to pay that $60 million, and so any activity was delayed until the court appeal had been settled. And of course that never happens overnight. And of course on the horizon another election, and everything goes on hold during election time because you don't know who's going to win the election, and so projects tend to, or no additional funding goes into projects by a government in case they lose and they don't have to then honour the project or the commitment. That's just another conspiracy theory. So by 2005, we had a kiosk that had cost the taxpayers around $55 million. And this is just a little excerpt from a newspaper article in 2005. So it says, in 2005, which is what, about 5 years down the track of the roof actually being blown off, it's described as stands unused behind a rusty scaffolding. So far, it's cost taxpayers $55 million, but the Sea Life Centre is nothing more than a glorified kiosk where you can get a cup of tea and go to the toilet. Ken Armstrong says the imposing steel and glass structure could have been opened 2 years previously if the state government had not allowed it to fall into disrepair. It had actually been finished in 2003 when insurers had finally paid for the storm damage in 2002. Okay, so 2005 it was still, well, it had actually gone backwards. And it went on from there. So the staff had effectively, well, they'd lost their jobs. They weren't waiting around for 3 or more years. Everybody just sort of drifted off and found new jobs, hopefully. It finally reopened in 2007. So that was 5 years after the roof blew off. Became part of the Penguin Parade and the Koala Conservation Centre. So what it is now is a cafe and gift shop. Cameras do monitor what the seals are doing and beam the information back. And your best way of actually viewing the seals, what they're doing, sitting on the seals on the rocks, is to take the Wild Ocean Eco Boat Tour, which takes you by boat to have a look at the seals on Seal Rocks. So that's just an overview. But I did a bit of a calculation based on the newspaper articles, and I came up with about $90 million to get back to the kiosk. 17 million for stage 1, 11 million for the car park, 55.9 to settle dispute, 9.3 in legal fees, 6.6 to finally get it up and running again. So the initial grand plan, the vision, would have cost $82 million. So the lifts, the under the sea rail shuttle, the 2 viewing platforms, plus stage 1, 82 million. And we've got a quite ordinary kiosk that has essentially cost the Victorian taxpayers $90 million because of contract mismanagement. That's it. What do you think? Are you impressed by the story or depressed? I think it beautifully highlights what a disaster mismanagement of a contract can be between the public and the private sector. But any big contract can end up in disaster if you do the sorts of things that were done here. All right, we'll leave it there and I'll see some of you shortly in the seminar. So you'll have a new appreciation of the centre the next time you go to Seal Rocks.
Should I list all the activities which are in the Gantt chart?
In the methodology.
Yeah.
The activities, but not the tasks.
Okay.
We're going
Because
to
I list maybe more than 15 we call the steps in the Gantt chart, so I just pick up some important things.
Are you coming to one of the seminars this week?
Maybe not. The seminar is maybe less small.
Yeah, tomorrow morning, because we're going to talk about all that in detail.
Okay.
And if you want to
Should I?
write about one of your activities and bring it along,
Yep.
we'll check to see that you're on track.
Not sure, should I write maybe some budget, how many people join this activity? Should I write this?
No, because that's in your Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, okay.
Let's see.
Should I explain why I use this?
You talk about what the activity is designed to do overall. So this is just background introduction.
This is not background.
Okay. So is this a task? This one?
Yeah. Actually, all the last sentence is about activity.
Yeah.
I use all the things to explain why. So I don't need write maybe how many people or how much money we have spent.
No, that's in your Excel spreadsheet. So that sounds like an activity rather than a task. That's an activity.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So this is another activity.
Both of these under this activity. This is activity and has three into tasks.
I think, well, to me, reading this, each one of these this sounds more like an activity that'll have a whole lot of steps in it.
Yeah.
Is that the way it is in Gantt chart?
I just finish it now.
Okay. So I think this should be an activity, and the next one should be an activity, and then there will be a whole lot of tasks in them. So how are you going to educate the staff, and how are you going to educate the ship owners?
This is activity.
Yeah. Yeah, but what are the tasks? Tasks. So you've got to develop educational material. You've got to organise a venue.
Yep.
You've got all those sorts of things. You have in your Gantt chart.
Yeah, I will write this.
Yeah, and you've got to contact people to get them to come. And so there'll be a whole lot of tasks under this activity. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, but that's a good description of the activity. That's fine. Okay. Sorry?